No.
I do. Yes, I hit the button already.
I can complain about users if we need an opener.
Isn't that our main shtick though?
I mean, it is, but like I have a specific thing that I can complain
What
about.
did the poor users do this time?
Okay, so picture this. You have a page.
Sure.
Okay. Nathan's like pointing at my microphone. You have a page. On the page, at the top of the page is a list of filters. Below the filters is a table of data.
Uh-huh.
Okay. You following me so
So
far?
this is like filters in the context of your shopping online, and you want to filter the results of something. Okay.
Yeah,
got
so
it,
you
got
have
it.
that. And then below the table, so you have the list of filters at the top.
Sure.
You have a table in the middle. Below the table, on the bottom right, you have 2 buttons. Okay? You're
Only
following me
2.
so far. Only 2 buttons.
Okay.
One button says export all data.
Okay.
The other button says export filtered data. What do you think those 2 buttons do?
They both export all the data.
Then you would be one of the users that I was dealing with.
Why doesn't the filter one export all the stuff?
Well, so that was specifically why I had it set up this way,
Uh-huh.
because I knew that, especially for this user, if I didn't have both options available, it was going to confuse them. Because then they would be like, well, it's exporting all the data. Why is it doing that? I want it to be filtered. Or if I had set it up to where it would only export the filtered data, then it would be the opposite. And it'd be, well, why can't I export all the data?
Uh-huh.
So I just put both buttons on there. It was easy enough to do.
Still not good enough.
No, because now the user is confused as to what those buttons are supposed to do and why there's 2 buttons and all that. So it's a lose-lose-lose
Do you have
situation.
a legend? You need to have a legend for your table.
I need to have like an instructional video pop up with every interaction.
No, so you need to have the buttons that are specifically labeled as to what they do. And then the filtering section needs to be filters and then filter and stuff. And then you need to have a legend down at the bottom that has a picture of a button and a small paragraph of a description of what the button does for each thing.
Or you have a third button that says 4 directions. Click here, and that's and the button says
have an FAQ
then,
for the page.
No, better yet, it says man whatever the application is called, and it brings up a man page.
I think that would be awesome.
No matter what
the person in question wouldn't read any of it, and that's the problem.
Exactly. No, see, and that's the best part is they're not going to read any of it, and that means you need to go ahead and implement a CAPTCHA.
Oh, God. Okay, CAPTCHA. That would be hilarious.
You have to put a CAPTCHA in.
Or, as I think you've mentioned, this is a thing that you've had to deal with or, a solution to a problem before.
Yeah.
You could implement an are you sure field for each button. And in the are you sure field, like when you click the export filtered results, you could have a thing that pops up that says, are you sure you would like to export all of the filtered results that you have selected?
I mean,
yes
if I were feeling really
and then the other button would say,
that.
are you sure that you would like to export all of the data from the below table?
And all you have to do is just implement that for one user ID.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
So that would definitely be like, and I can do that.
No. See, I got the best idea. You should implement a button that does this. Welcome to the Cheeky and Fun Podcast. I'm your host, John, joined here today by...
No, we don't have that kind of a
Welcome
podcast.
to the Hostility Morning Show. I'm your host, John, joined here today by...
Nathan.
Matthew.
Steven,
why can't we have cheeky and funness here? Why you gotta ruin the mood?
What? I was just trying to interrupt you.
Well, you did.
I
You succeeded.
I mean, I was going to say something, so you just beat me to it.
Well,
thank you.
It's all right. It's still nowhere near as bad as the interruption the FTC did to the current, small business. Well, actually, any business really in America right now.
Actually, I think it probably is going to affect more larger businesses than smaller
business
ones.
management.
Well, Steven, can you go ahead and explain to the individuals that are potentially listening to this, what are we discussing today?
We are going to discuss very interesting hot topic about a FTC ruling.
It's ruling.
Yeah, FCC ruling that came down that outlaws non-compete agreements.
Quick, what does FTC stand? FTC.
Federal Trade Commission.
Thank you.
What's the Federal Trade Commission? Okay.
It federally
Google it.
Does things with trade and such.
Trade and Commerce.
Trade and commerce. It's a commission that regulates trade and commerce.
What's a commission?
Commission is a group of morons.
I thought that's what you earned when you sold things. Now that I've derailed this completely, why don't we get into some of the nitty grittiness? So we're going to be discussing non-compete and obviously the FTC ruling that has pretty much outlawed it for the majority of the current businesses on the market. There is an exclusion
There's
to
some
it.
exceptions.
There
yes.
are a couple exceptions there, but this is going to be very interesting in the terms of the business landscape kind of moving forward, because this not only affects technology, this affects anyone that does commerce in the United States. So you're talking small to large business. You're discussing, some of the key issues of what the non-compete clause was even originally intended for, how was it being implemented, how was it broadened over the years, and ultimately why the FTC felt this should have been struck down.
That is, except for, and especially noted in the ruling, stockyards and meat packers.
Yeah, that was very
Doesn't
interesting.
count towards those.
I know. I was like, I would like a little more clarification as to why
I read
they
in-
are
I read
excluded.
into it a little bit. It's still fairly top level. I didn't go too deep. But based on the synopsis of the stockyard and meat packers thing, I can't remember exactly if it wasn't a ruling. It was it was based on a federal lawsuit. The results of that is an act, I believe.
Mhm.
But it basically outlines very specific things that those people in those industries cannot do for the purposes of kind of for the same purposes, for the fair competition, making sure that there's no monopolies, things like that. It's very detailed as far as that act goes. And so I believe that the reason it was excluded from this is it's already thorough enough to cover that area
Mhm.
that they didn't feel like this could have either interfered with that act or like overruled it, or just muddied the waters to an extent that wasn't
Yeah.
realistic.
But they're also not the only ones that are excluded from
Nope.
this. The other individuals that are those that I believe they're labeled as like not executive committee, but like they're the main kind of C-suite individuals that typically make over that $151,000.
Decision makers in a company.
Yeah. Policymakers. So
Policy, yes.
it's you have to make over that $151,000, approximately that, annually, and you have to be a policymaker. So those two have to be with each other for you to be then excluded from this, at least in the current ruling, which there is still some wiggle room in there where that potential exclusion may also go away. But at least from this point in time, those are the only people that are not covered
Well,
by this.
also, it excludes kind of the finance sector, bankers, loan officers, things like that. In finances, it specified banks, credit unions, and something I can't remember if it mentioned like investment type stuff.
So don't work in money,
as
work around
well-
money.
as well as airlines. That was the one that kind of caught, besides the stockyard thing, that caught my attention. It mentioned carriers. It mentioned like common carriers, freight carriers, and a third type of carrier specifically in the exclusions. But yeah, that was the other kind of weird one. I'm not exactly sure why
Yeah.
it was specified, but that's the gist of it. It's basically that management level over decision or policymakers over 151,000. Technically, it's $151,341 annually.
Well, I'm glad you had that memorized.
Ish.
I only remember that like 151,000. So that
Roughly
approximation
in the
there.
ballpark.
Yeah.
The any industry that falls within the Stockyard and Packers Act, and then the bankers, federal credit union, that kind of thing, as well as the carriers, which carriers define it's airline, air travel. Yeah.
Well, before we get too far into the weeds, Nathan, can you at least explain to the people what a non-compete clause is?
So, according to the definition that we are currently working out of, What is a non-compete clause? FTC defines non-compete clauses as a contractual term between an employer and a worker that blocks an employer and a worker from working for a competing employer or starting a competing business, typically within a certain geographical area and period of time after the worker's employment ends.
Can I just say something before we go
Yes.
forward?
Sure.
Legal document phonetics are the most irritating thing in existence. I
Well,
understand
yeah.
why they are the way they are, but my God, reading this stuff is just
Legal jargon.
And if you're a
Yeah.
lawyer and you just cringed at that, I'm sorry.
well, not even the jargon. Like the jargon is one thing; it's the phonetics of it. It's how it's worded, in a way that it's to make sure that to make sure there's no loopholes. But it's the
Words have meaning,
there's
but
like
they're given too much meaning.
it's like
here.
the
Well,
repetitive
they're
do's don't.
fixed definitions.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be.
But anyway, just I had to
Yeah.
thank you for coming to my talk.
Well, there you go. And from somebody who had to study, state law for a number of years, I will tell you this: this is still way easier to understand than what that was. So, and again, it was supposed to be the some of the reason why it's written in this way is based off of again tradition and having clear terminology that has a fixed meaning, so that at least when it comes to the interpretation of this, you're able to then look at what are the actual clear definitions of these words and what do they actually state
Then why
in,
then why are they not using thou and hence and shan't?
because you don't always have to use old English
I like the word
English in all
shan't.
of this. You can use shan't as much as you want. Like you shan't continue to interrupt me right now. Anyways, so thank you, Nathan, for at least kind of elaborating a bit more on what the non-compete clause is. Now, what does it do? So, at least from a broadened term, and again, this has come from the perspective of somebody who has been under non-compete clauses before, and not being completely barred from going and working at other competitors, but definitely under threat of suit that it's possible. These are just a couple of key areas that it does affect the free market system that we as Americans are kind of working under. They restrict workers from a better employment opportunity, meaning if you want to go work for either a direct competitor or if you see an opportunity where you can take like a few key areas of what the business does great as and shrink that down to a smaller use case and then let that be your little niche. Under the old laws, you could not do that because the whole thing of non-compete is it's trying to protect the business, its intellectual property, its practices, its policies, things that it developed, and is saying, no, we're going to put our stake in the ground. We own this. You cannot take it and go somewhere else and do the exact same thing. So that's stopping that section of the free market. It also prevents workers from leaving jobs that decrease the competition for workers and thus lowers workers' wages. So, meaning if you had 5 businesses that were all doing pretty much the exact same thing, one can go, "Hey, no, we did this first. Everyone who currently works here, you need to go sign this document. You can't go work for business A, B, or C because you work for business D. So now we're going to control where you can work, your opportunities inside the organization, your current compensation for the work that you do, and if you go and try and do anything outside the bounds of what we said you can and cannot do, we can then threaten lawsuit against you."
Now, I will say that at least based on the reading I did, it seems like uh, the FTC's kind of motivation for some of this was really to crack down on and do away with what they saw as or what they see as a increasing and uh, large number of non-competes in multiple industries across the country that have become so generalized and
Broad.
ambiguous, I think is one of the words they used, to the point to where it covers a lot of those things that, with very loose verbiage, it covers those things that you just mentioned, like making it almost impossible for an employee to just have a better opportunity in the field that they're working in,
Mhm.
and try to go somewhere else and either make more money or just have a better work environment. Uh, because it's not to say that there are not non-compete agreements out there right now that are ambiguous. There are some that are out there that are very specific. It may give a specific time period that it applies to. It may give very specific, like, oh, well, you can't go work for another competitor in our specific region or territory. You could, in theory, like if you went into another state and worked for another industry or another business that was in our same industry that qualified as a competitor, but it's outside of our territory, that's fine, just not within this region. There
Yeah.
are some out there that are like that, but the FTC cites that in their research they found a growing number, enough for them to make this ruling, of non-competes that are so ambiguous that they are just stifling to the free market and stifling to workers' rights.
Yeah, and one that I found incredibly interesting researching this topic was actually from a veterinarian that he worked out of Detroit. So when he got out of doing all of his pre-med and his training and everything and his residency, you know, at this period of time, he was working for this one very well-known veterinary service at this hospital. He had an opportunity that was, and this is very specific, so that was 24.8 miles away that he wanted to go and potentially work for. I mean, he obviously, that new employer really wanted him. They were going after him hard, working with as much as they can, but because of the non-compete, had a clause in there that stated the new employment has to be outside of a 25-mile air radius from this existing building. You cannot. And that was threat of they would come after with full legal recourse against him if he went and worked there.
Wow.
And this was including that the new employer was willing to actually pay for the readjustment of that air radius down to that 24.8 so he would qualify. So, but no, because of this type of clause, not possible. So now this veterinarian can't go work essentially 90 minutes away
Yeah.
because he's in Detroit at a completely different region of service just because of this one little contractual agreement here,
Yeah.
which I think is utter bullcrap. But, I also can see the point in like what during our research, like, was everything about non-compete bad? No. There were a few key areas that was like, okay, this makes sense. Like, again, protecting some of the intellectual property, making sure that, hey, if you were working on something right now that was about to go under like patent submission, you definitely don't want somebody like an engineer on that team to then go, well, before this is actually, fully patented and approved, let's go spin up a side business over here, develop the exact same thing, and then try and submit that for that same patent.
Yeah.
And then you're going to be in a patent dispute with your direct competitor, which used to be an employee of yours.
Well, and that's too, like, there's a case to be made. I'll at least say that in the in the industry that we work in, for a non-compete agreement to be understandable. I'm not saying right. I'm just saying, like, it falls within this area where you could say, okay, managed services IT. In some, it's a fairly competitive area, especially in some regions. You could say that it would be reasonable for an employer to say, like, at a medium-sized company, to say, oh, well, I'm going to have, I'm hiring on a higher level, analyst or engineer, someone who's got skills and who's going to be very useful to this company and moving us forward. And I'm going to have them sign a non-compete agreement because it's possible for them to come in, get some experience with, workflow. They may have the desire to start up their own business, and they would have the capability to go out and run a smaller shop, but with the same business model, and take some of our potential clients that we would be going after. So I'm going to have them sign a non-compete agreement that says, you coming on to work for us, even may or may not be within a time period, but just say, if you leave this company, you are not legally allowed to go and start your own business to compete with us directly, because you could just, take our methods and take our workflow and all that and copy paste that into a smaller business but directly compete with us.
And I kind of want to open this up more to the table here of, because I mean, obviously with this new ruling and the landscape is changing on what the opportunity for, I mean, really everyone here having a much better opportunity without a threat of, legal recourse against you if you want to go jump to new position. Before, if you weren't under one of these, you had that afforded to you. You can go do it whenever you wanted. But those individuals that are locked into this, they definitely couldn't. And I kind of want to see like what your guys' opinions regarding what non-compete was supposed to be doing, and now with this elimination, what potential risk does this actually open up to the free market?
In my opinion, the main benefit of it is the protection of intellectual property and those, I guess you could say, transition periods of you have a team and whatever have put in extensive amount of work in whatever, and you are trying to prevent them from taking what it is that's been worked on. And from the standpoint of industries that are very heavy on like physical goods, whether it be large engineering or something like that, there's a lot that you can quote unquote take with you. But there's also a lot that you can't. If you're building out prototypes, you can't take the prototype with you. That's theft. That's pretty straightforward. If you are building out a algorithm, that gets a little harder to lock down. You're building out processes, that's very hard to lock down. And if you don't want to, and if you either don't want to patent or you're in the process of patenting, as was mentioned earlier, you also don't want that being removed. So those, in my opinion, are um, elements that a non-compete agreement would help with in a fair way, because the reality is, depending on, in some instances, what you're doing, you are voluntarily limiting your ability to go other places for certain periods of time. I think probably one of the more extreme examples is if you are working at a government funded lab and you have security clearances, in some respects you've limited yourself. I know people that work in, especially those that like in support roles of C-suites. They have certain restrictions that they have to follow because they are party to privileged information that has other legal regulations around it.
And to be fair, that is, for that example specifically, it's excluded from this ruling because they would fall into that decision maker management role over that salary threshold. And for those reasons, because that I agree, that's a good point.
And I'm even talking about if like we're in technical support, theoretically, if we have certain, I'm being intentionally vague here, but if there is certain clients, if we were to bring them in or if we were to expand in certain industries, even though we would be under that six-figure limit for our own salaries, we could still be party to information that limits what we can do for certain periods of time. And so that principle from a non-compete side of things does make sense.
To be fair, though, at least to your examples of process and intellectual property, non-material intellectual property, and stuff like that. Um, one of the other things that this rule excludes, so this rule is specifically to outlaw non-compete agreements. It does not have any effect whatsoever on non-disclosure. There's several other type of non-agreements, and one of those is non-disclosure agreement. Those are still perfectly and completely valid and legal. And some of the things that you're talking about that are very much valid for a organization to protect, that could be handled by a non-disclosure agreement, not necessarily a non-compete agreement.
That's where my thought process was on this whole thing. Like what Nathan's describing sounds a lot more like it would fit a non-disclosure agreement. I don't at this time have too much of an issue with a non-disclosure agreement. Like that makes sense that companies
Again, as
need to
long as
have
it's
a way.
not vague, as long as it's not
Yeah.
ambiguous, as long as it is specific to the things that are reasonable for them to
Yeah,
protect,
it is.
that's perfect.
If it is the company's trying to protect their intellectual property, that
Mhm.
makes sense. I'm okay with that. The non-competes don't make any sense to me from a free market standpoint, as we've kind of already discussed. All it does, from what I see, is stifle competition, which should be what we want, right? The only person the only entity it benefits is the organization. It doesn't benefit anybody else. Because it doesn't benefit the employee because you're stifling where the employee can go and what they can do. Like take for example, let's say that you have one of the examples that I saw was you have a non-disclosure agreement that says that you can't work in the same industry for 5 years, and there wasn't too much of a like a geographical area. It was just you can't work in this industry
in general, yeah.
in general for 5 years. You're just SOL. It's too bad, so sad. In that case, especially in the information technology industry, most of what our most of what any career is driven by is experience, right? What do you have experience in? What can you do? And if you're being told that, oh, you can't use your experience for the next 5 years, you're just supposed to let it stagnate, you're going to have to go find something completely different to do. I don't see how that benefits anybody except for the company in an unfair way, if that makes sense. Like a non-disclosure agreement, that makes sense. Instead of you can't work in the same industry. Like let's say that I was working for Google and I signed a non-disclosure agreement that said I can't talk about the proprietary information, like the algorithm or what have you of the search engine and all that. I can't talk about that for 5 years. That makes sense to me, and I would still be able to go work for Microsoft on Bing, or I could go work for DuckDuckGo or something like that. I still have the opportunity to use the knowledge, the abstract knowledge that I have obtained and the skills that I have honed in this particular area, but I'm not allowed to disclose the proprietary inner workings of specific things. I know it can kind of get messy because knowledge is knowledge, and so the easy way out is a non-compete. Like, no, you just can't do that. But I don't think that it's an easy solution, but it's not a good solution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense because, I mean, again, the difference between the non-disclosure agreement versus the non-compete agreement, at least with the NDA, you are still protecting the intellectual property to an extent because at least some NDAs that I've had to sign before is yes, I'm not only am I not allowed to discuss this, I'm also not allowed to share any key details around like its inner working. So I might have privy knowledge of how this operation, goes around. But if I decide to, hey, leave this organization, go somewhere else that does the exact same thing, I cannot share those same intellectual property secrets from organization to organization. So that way they're not getting another, leading edge into that same kind of sphere. So that to me is like, okay, you're still getting some of the benefits of the protection of intellectual property, but you're not stifling the opportunity of the worker, locking them into basically you're only allowed to work for this one organization in this exact way. So that's at least something that can be put into practice to fill in a partial gap of what this was attempting to do, but it's still not a catch-all. It's not going to solve everything, but at least it's a step in a direction that could start leading more towards what.
Well, especially because there's specific industry. I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply to every industry that would use a non-compete agreement. But there are industries where, like, an individual, something specialized that's in the STEM, the
Yeah.
STEM industries. Um, a whole aspect of that is you study things in primary school, you go to secondary school, you get a higher education, you get you educate yourself with specific knowledge to get into those industries, and the whole career path there. I mean, sure, your ideal career path is you go to good school, blah blah blah, get your degree, you go straight into like a large corporation with a lot of upward mobility, and you just work your way through their whole career. That's not reality for the vast majority of people. The reality would be a stepping stone progression through your career where you would get your education, you'd go to work at maybe a smaller company, get a lot of good experience, ground floor experience there, hone your skills, move on to a slightly larger organization or the low end of a big organization and then work your way up. So there's a lot of career paths that realistically should take you on a stepping stone journey through multiple companies. And this having these non-compete agreements with the way that they've developed would provide smaller companies, they do provide smaller companies a means of locking in some of that talent, uh, unknowing to some people, and say, "Oh, well, that's cool. You can come work here. Yeah, we'll put you in like maybe a mid tier position or not just a low end or something. Because they'll
Mhm.
entice you in, and then but you got to sign this little non compete. It's fine, just this little."
Well, I mean,
And
it's
but
been
that
it's been a
effectively locks you into that company because it
yeah.
says, "Oh, but if you want to leave, no, you can't go and work in at any other company in this type of industry, just period, point blank."
Yeah, and like that's
And then that kills that
it,
kills
it
your
kills your
stepping
entire
stone
growth.
journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing there, and
And
that's
again, it's not to say that every single non compete is like that, but that is being seen that there are
it's
some like
large
that.
enough to be
Yeah.
recognized as a problem in the FTC's own filing
Yep.
of in their reasoning of why this needs to go away. But there are definitely those that are out there. They're saying nope, this needs to come back. And like what's being brought up, Stephen, by one of your resources, uh, with the courts now, it's going to court, really to kind of argue this. Like on one of yours, I believe it was the Ryan versus the FTC,
Mm.
which was a district court in the Northern District of Texas, filed a preliminary enjoining the implementation and enforcement against the plaintiff and the plaintiff's inventors of the FTC rule, banning almost all non-compete agreements between employers and workers. So they are basically claiming that no, you shouldn't have done this. This is going to hurt the industry more than it's going to benefit it, even beyond the reasons of what they stated in their own filing.
Yeah, I believe that there are currently, at the time of recording, there are 3 lawsuits, all very similar. That's one of them. That's one of the bigger ones. There's that one and the one in Pennsylvania, I think, are the 2 big ones.
Mhm.
But just they're very similar filings for very similar reasons or the same similar justifications. And it's the flip side of this argument, which is employers saying, "Wait a minute." One of the big things is just the straight up, oh, the FTC does not have the power and the right to make this ruling.
which
Uh,
is a legitimate
yeah, there's a big question of,
question to ask at least.
and it's on several levels. It's questioning just the clause that founded the FTC. They're basically their parameters of what the organization, the commission, is allowed to do in general. And then there's the whole argument of Chevron deference and that whole thing.
Well, and I just want
Which
to
that's a
I
we
just
don't
want
have
to
to go into
I
that.
want to
But
preface this just before we get too heavy into the legalese side. Is we're not lawyers.
nope.
This isn't legal advice. This is opinions of idiot technology guys that have worked, in this industry for a number of years. But again,
Not opinionated at all.
not opinionated at all. This is merely pretty much a
We're 4 idiots with microphones,
yes.
so take our counsel accordingly.
It's not counsel. This is this is conjecture around the table.
Yeah, there we
That's
go.
all this is.
Yeah.
Pontificating.
But yeah, a big the questions being, it's just, do they simply have the authority to make this rule in the first place, and then also questioning on just the grounds of the alternate opinion of this will hinder small businesses' ability to get and retain any kind of talent so that they can compete in the market. It will go to encourage monopolies, create and encourage monopolies and things like that, because bigger companies will be able to entice talent away from smaller companies. It's those types of
Yeah,
arguments.
and that which is an interesting argument because then the counter argument always is no, because then those engineers that don't want to work for the big companies or organizations or those that were helping develop these technologies or these practices or the intellectual property, whatever this is, if they want to go and just do this same thing on a smaller scale and a small business type of facto, they 100% can, which again is helping to open up development, push that kind of property more forward, provide more opportunities, and hopefully be able to continue to push that industry in a direction where you have more options. Which again, when it comes to development side, when you have multiple competitors in the same space, that drives innovation. And innovation drives costs down, which only benefits the consumer and also the business because, again, it's a cheaper option for them to then start offering and developing for while still having their little niche and spin on what this is. So you still have multiple ways to make profit. You're having multiple ways to be able to develop the same thing. And you're having, the consumer being able to choose which option is best. Ergo, the entire reason why we have a free market.
And the interesting thing too about that Ryan case specifically, the one in Texas, is as of right now, that case has been, or that injunction has been ruled on by the court, and it has been granted, but it has not. They did not grant a.
Is it it's not a full injunction, is it?
No, it's a limited injunction, so it only
Hmm.
applies to the plaintiffs. There were 3 plaintiffs, I believe, in that case. So 3 companies and or individuals that brought the case forward, and so the judge granted the injunction, but only to them. So the rule as a whole, as far as that court goes, is still set to go in place on its go live date. We'll call it that.
Which is
120 days
yeah,
after
120
it
days
was,
after it
yeah,
was
it's
filed.
September 4th, 2024 is the I'm calling it the go live date.
Yeah.
Because it was placed at right. It was placed, I think it was April 30th or something was when they announced.
I believe so.
But anyway, so and I believe, I don't know the ruling on like the Pennsylvania case, but I believe it's probably similar deal where it's going to be a limited injunction, not a full injunction. So for all intents and purposes, unless their final ruling, I believe, comes on August 30th, they wanted to make sure and do it like
Like on or before, yeah.
Exactly. And so, things may change. But as of right now, it looks like the rule will go into place in its 99.9999% capacity in September.
What's interesting, one of the things I find interesting about all of this is it is highly beneficial to companies who want to rely on legal paperwork to retain talent. So my biggest problem with the non-compete side of things is not only does it have the potential to stifle innovation, it has the potential of limit, as much, in my opinion, has much greater implications in limiting competition. And it also empowers companies to rely on locking people down and not making them enticing to work for. So if you look at it from a large corporate standpoint, you have a lot of people that will work in a large corporate environment that enjoy working for big companies. I mean, there are quite a few benefits to working for a large company. And depending on the industry you're in, you get access to a lot of cool things. You get to do a lot of cool things. And that, for many people, is going to outweigh the downsides of working for a large corporation. There are other people that prefer working for a smaller company. And where you have a large company, you're going to have a lot of smaller competitors. That's unless it is heavily regulated, it's generally how it works. For every, yes, we all know of, enter your large retailer, enter your large beverage maker, enter blah, 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 blah. There's dozens of smaller ones out there that perform the same function. And a non-compete makes it incredibly difficult, especially if you want to move, say, down the ladder. Let's say you want to go from a large corporation and an opportunity presents itself to work for a smaller local operation. The benefits may not be as good. The pay is typically going to be comparable. And I guess you could say the scope of what you can do is going to be a little bit more limited. But depending on your stage in life, depending on what your other life goals are, maybe the corporate job has you working a ton of extra hours and doing a ton of travel, and you're in a stage in life where you want to focus on your family. Well, a smaller company with a more regional footprint may be an excellent option for you. And and if there's a non-compete that you can't stay in your industry for say 2 years or whatever, then you can't make that move. And realistically, if you are making a move like this for non-career growth motives, you're not going to be able to afford to just sit around for 2. And you're probably not going to have the broadness of skill to jump to a different career for a few years and work there before you jump back.
So to add some context, the way that things are implemented here in America is different than other countries, as is typical. I remember reading somewhere, and I'll have to find a source that we can put in the show notes, but I remember reading somewhere that there are other countries, I would assume countries in the EU, that the way that they have non-compete set up is that if the employer forces the employee to sign a non-compete, one of the restrictions on that is that for the duration of the clause, the employer is responsible for continuing to pay the employee.
That's still present in some in the U.S.
Okay, because in that instance,
That's called like a garden clause
That-
or a garden something.
yeah, that kind of I would be kind of okay with that because the it's not just a, well, you're stuck with us.
The company's willing to pay,
Or-
to pay you to have to stay
Yeah.
on vacation for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah.
Effect,
I like that.
just so you're not in the market competing.
There's a little bit more quid pro quo there. But as is, if that's not the case, which it's not, that's not a rule, so it's up to the employer to be
Voluntary,
benevolent
yeah.
in that case. The way that it's structured, it's very much, it is the employer is allowed to dictate how and where the employee uses their skills, which I don't think is okay. I can't.
I would agree on its face, like that's
As
it's
we've been
not
talking
right.
about this, especially with non-disclosure agreements being an option, this just doesn't make any sense. I have a Wikipedia page pulled up here on the non-compete clause, which we can add in there. The second paragraph on the page, after the definition that we've already gone over, says non-compete agreements are rooted in the medieval system of apprenticeship, whereby an older master craftsman, this is much older than I thought it was, I see that look on your face, whereby an older master craftsman took on a younger apprentice, trained the apprentice, and in some cases entered into an agreement whereby the apprentice would not compete with the master after the apprenticeship. Modern uses of non-compete agreements are generally premised on preventing high-skilled workers from transferring trade secrets or a customer list from one firm to a competing firm, thus giving the competing firm a competitive advantage. However, many non-compete clauses apply to low-wage workers or individuals who do not possess transferable trade secrets. And in that case, like again, it seems like the modern evolution, because I was trying to figure out the chicken and the egg thing, like which came first, non-competes or non-disclosures. And from what I've seen, non-disclosures came way, way after non-competes. The earliest record of a non-compete was, at least according to this, as far back as Dyer's case in 1414.
I mean, as we all know, Wikipedia is the end all be all of sources, right?
So non-competes have been a thing for at least 500, 600 years, over 600 years. So the modern evolution seems to be the non-disclosure agreement because you can control the flow of information.
It's definitely much more narrow focused on here's what you can and cannot, share when it comes to the resources here.
Yeah.
Which again, that's why it's like I'm a bigger fan of NDAs because I've signed way more NDAs than I have non-competes.
If it is giving the employer the ability to control how and where the employer's intellectual property is used, that's fine. That's their right to do so.
Yeah, but
it's
doesn't.
when the employee's skills come into play. That's where
Correct.
I don't see this making any
It
sense.
doesn't stifle at all the actual work the individual employee is doing.
Or is able to do elsewhere.
Correct. It's just stifling what they are allowed to share.
Yeah.
And there's a very big, clear distinction between the two because, especially on the non-compete side, is saying you hold this information, you know this information, you cannot at all go and use that same skill set that you developed here at anywhere else. That is simply locked into here. Whereas the NDA is, you know all this information here. We're just going to say you can go work for a direct competitor or you can go start up your own thing and build your own business from the ground up, but you cannot use or at least publicly share the information that you are taking from here that you helped develop.
Yeah.
It's one of those things like, again, when like you have people like from our modern examples of when you have guys like uh the lead engineer on the AMD graphics card team that went to Intel and all of them, when they kind of took some of that knowledge base and technology that direction, is like, well, I mean, yeah, they developed that at this company. Now they're using similar practices here at this company. What gives? What's going on there? I mean, technically, aren't they competing in the same space? Yes, but they're also not in the same type of market implementation. So it's like same similar baseline technology, but not being implemented in the exact same manner. So technically, not really competing in the same market share.
Yeah.
So that's where this is going to start being a really interesting factoid of, well, there was a non-compete technically in that area, but now that that's almost to the point of not being applicable, what type of opportunities is that now going to open the door for, not just technology but industry as a wide? Like, again, kind of going back to the example of that veterinary scenario, now you're going to be able to allow doctors, veterinary systems, other kind of key important service roles are going to be able to have more open opportunity. If they don't like where they're working, they're no longer just going to be locked here in pretty much a hell job situation where you hate your employer, you want to leave, the employer is holding you here because it's legal contract, and they now pretty much have full control of you from your current work standpoint, and there's nothing you can do. Now this at least gives you some ground and standing in that fight to be able to go and at least provide a better opportunity for yourself.
I wanted to read this excerpt from this article that's going to be in the show notes. It's one of the things that we were looking at. This speaks to the point that you made, Matthew, the point that you brought up. The the thing that I was referring to. It's called a garden leave clause, and that's and that kind of plays into, there is an exception to this rule by the FTC, and that is an exception, but there's a specific key part of that type of agreement where that makes it an exception, but there's another type that is outlawed by this rule, and then there's one key part of that. So I'm just going to read this real quick. So this says, in the discussion section for the rule, the FTC indicates that forfeiture for competition provisions as penalizing employees, and also states that a severance arrangement in which the worker is paid only if they refrain from competing would be a penalty. Additionally, the FTC also notes that a payment to a prospective competitor to stay out of the market may also violate the antitrust laws, even if it is not a non-compete under this rule. The next section is it's kind of a FAQ deal. It says, is garden leave covered by the ban? No. The FTC acknowledges that garden leave provisions where a worker is still employed and receiving the same total annual compensation and benefits on a pro rata basis are not non-competes because they are not a post-employment restriction.
Yeah.
So those are two different, but those are two different.
That's a good way of
It's
phrasing
kind
it.
of two different ways to
Post-employment
skin a
restriction.
cat.
Yeah.
A employer could say, "Oh, cool, you can leave, you can quit your job,
Yeah.
and we will give you a severance package, but that severance package is based on you not competing with us."
Yeah.
So it's like, we'll give you a severance package for 2 years, and it will include your benefits, it'll include your pay, all that, all that stuff, but with the addendum on there that you cannot go to another employer or start your own, but you cannot compete with us in the market during the terms of that severance package. The garden leave is, you are not released from your employment. You are still an employee of the company, therefore receiving your salary and your benefits as an employee. You're just not actively working. It's what's my favorite word? Sabbatical, basically.
Okay.
For all intents and purposes, like you're on voluntary sabbatical and still receiving pay, but you're still an employee. And that's the key difference between those at the FTC sites, where one is okay because you're still employed.
Yeah.
The other is not okay because your employment has been terminated voluntarily or not voluntarily. And you're, in my words, in simple terms, being bribed not to compete in the marketplace.
I mean, that's no different than if a company has a patent that they just intentionally patent to never do anything with for the extent of the patent, because that would then interfere with their product line or something like that. You're just doing that with people.
Yeah, and it goes back to my previous point. I don't think the employer should be able to dictate what the employee does with their skills.
Mhm.
What, where, and how they use their skills.
Yeah, I knew I had seen that in one of those articles, and I was looking. I finally found it, and so I just wanted to make commentate on that and read that to give that
Yeah,
clarification.
and I mean, it's from the non-disclosure agreements. I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody's been subject to one of those, like so in some form, some kind of you're not
Mhm.
allowed to talk about this.
Yeah, because some can be real simple, some can be very detailed. Or
Yeah,
broad
like
or,
in all of the jobs that I've had, there's been some level of, hey, this is proprietary information. Like when I was working in retail, some of the sales numbers and things like that, you're not allowed to talk about these, or we strongly discourage you from talking about these. That's on the organization side of things. This is their policy. On the federal side of things, there's a couple of things that I'm familiar with. One is FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which is protecting um, educational information on an individual. And then I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with HIPAA, HIPAA, the Health Health Information Portable Availability Act. I didn't look that up. I had it pulled up, but I
Sure,
couldn't
you
find it on the
did.
page. Yeah.
Sure, you weren't
HIPAA.
reading that off the screen.
Both of those are forms. At least it's not. There's a different term for it. Not a non-disclosure, but like a
Regulation.
yeah, like it makes sense. It's the privacy of information. In this case, it's protecting the individual. In the case of most non-disclosures, it's protecting the like we've already discussed, the organization's intellectual property or trade secrets. Those cases, I think that's where the those are the tools that the organizations should be using to protect their trade secrets, not just a blanket ban on, hey, this person can't go do anything for X amount of time just because they worked here.
And the more we discuss this, the more I think this through. The more this is just in general, especially as it is implemented, it's an excuse for bad management, and it's an
100%.
and it's an excuse for even it's not so much even just preventing people from going to work elsewhere. It is giving excuses for not actually providing competitive benefits, not providing competitive compensation.
Yeah, it's resource oversight. It's you're able to pretty much just go, hey, the only place you can really work is here. So we're just
Deal
gonna
with it.
pretty much essentially we're just gonna hold you hostage as much as we
This
legally
is
can.
we've talked about this in a previous episode that my number one thing that I absolutely hate is when somebody tells me that this is just the way that things have always been done, right? Like if that's
We know.
that's an explanation of that's why things are currently being done like today. That's why you did this. But that's not an explanation of why we continue to do this.
Well-
What we're talking about here with the non-competes is a perfect example. This is a practice that's been around for at least 600 years according to Wikipedia.
And probably
And
even longer.
nobody's
Yeah.
not many people have questioned it. I won't say nobody because the FTC did say, "Hey, this isn't okay." This is a perfect example of what I mean by that. Where there's a lot of organizations out there that just say, "Well, this is the way that things have always been done." And we're stuck with it.
And not to and I make this statement not as in a way of expressing my true opinion on the matter because I'll be honest, even after doing the research for this episode and looking into it more and thinking about it more, I'm still for all intents and purposes on the fence. I can see both sides of the argument and I can see it's some merits on both sides. But a question that does have to be that I feel has to be asked in this particular case is as well. While even if the the thought is good and the result of this is a net positive, is federal regulation is that the way that this problem should be solved?
That's a fair question.
It's a complete fair question. I think that's going to be best where why don't we kind of leave it up to the audience? Why don't we hear kind of their opinions on what this is and where it resides and kind of their feelings on should the government even be directly involved in this or should this be more of a employer employee discussion that needs to be kind of hashed out?
Or should this be a legislative discussion?
Potentially. So
We would love to hear your thoughts.
yeah, Hear your thoughts. And like again, we want to thank you for joining us for the Hustling Morning podcast. If you stayed this long and like what you heard, leave a comment and let us know. You can hit us up on X, formerly known as the platform Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or info@hustlingmorning.com. We upload every other Tuesday real early on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. If you want a one-stop shop for everything hostile, you can find us at hostileinthemorning.com. And remember, have a hostile morning.